A forgotten letter, a message lost in time, but when it finally reaches its intended recipient, it leaves a decorated general utterly speechless. What could have been written in that letter to shake a man who has seen it all? Let us know in the comments section below. What would you do if a letter from your past came back to haunt you? The smell of dust and aged paper lingered in the air as Second Lieutenant Daniel Foster carefully lifted the worn envelope from the back of an old filing cabinet. The military base's records room was a relic of the past, filled with decades of history that no one had cared to sort through. He had been assigned the mundane task of archiving old documents, an effort to clear space for digital files, but nothing he had encountered so far had seemed remotely significant. That was, until now. The envelope was yellowed, its edges brittle, and the ink on the front had faded slightly. Yet the name was still legible. General Robert Keegan. Foster furrowed his brow. The name was familiar. Keegan was a legend in military circles, a retired four-star general who had commanded forces in some of the most significant conflicts of the late 20th century. But why had this letter, addressed to such a prominent figure, never been delivered? Turning the envelope over, he saw a return address. Chaplain Thomas Calloway, 3rd Infantry Battalion, Cambodia 1974. A chill ran down his spine. He wasn't even born when this letter had been written. Cambodia, 1974. That was during the final years of the Vietnam War. His fingers hesitated over the seal. He wasn't sure why, but something about this felt sacred, like opening it would be crossing a line he had no business crossing. The fact that it had remained sealed for 40 years told him one thing: whatever was inside, Keegan had never read it. Foster made up his mind. This wasn't for him. He needed to find General Keegan. It took some digging, but with the help of a few phone calls and a favor from a contact at the Pentagon, Foster tracked down Keegan's address in Virginia. The general had been retired for over 2 decades, living in quiet solitude in a small town outside Arlington. Standing on the front porch of a modest yet dignified home, Foster took a steadying breath before knocking. The door opened moments later, revealing a tall, broad-shouldered man in his late 70s. His once dark hair had turned silver, and deep lines were etched across his face, telling the story of a lifetime of leadership, battle, and sacrifice. Keegan eyed the young officer curiously. "Something I can help you with, son?" Foster snapped to attention out of instinct. "Sir, my name is Second Lieutenant Daniel Foster. I was recently assigned to records maintenance at Fort Bragg, and I found something that I believe belongs to you." He extended the letter. Keegan's sharp eyes locked onto it immediately. His expression, once unreadable, shifted ever so slightly. A flicker of something, recognition, hesitation, crossed his face. Slowly he reached out, his fingers trembling slightly as they brushed against the aged paper. For a long moment he simply stared at it. Keegan started, then stopped himself. His throat worked as if trying to swallow something heavy. Foster waited, unsure if he should say something, but before he could, Keegan exhaled deeply and stepped aside. "Come in," the general said quietly. Foster hesitated only for a moment before following him inside. The past, it seemed, was finally catching up to Robert Keegan. The living room was decorated with the quiet dignity of a man who had spent a lifetime carrying burdens that no one else could see. The walls bore framed photographs of a younger Robert Keegan, standing among his soldiers, shaking hands with world leaders and receiving commendations for his service. In the corner, an old wooden cabinet housed a folded American flag, next to a set of medals neatly arranged in a glass case. Daniel Foster followed the general inside, unsure whether to sit or stand. Keegan moved with the steady composure of someone who had spent years commanding rooms filled with men waiting for orders. He finally lowered himself into a well-worn leather chair, the letter still clutched in his hands. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. "You found this in the archives?" Keegan finally asked, his voice quieter than Foster expected. "Yes, sir, it was in an old filing cabinet. I don't think anyone had seen it in decades." Keegan turned the letter over in his hands, his thumb tracing the name on the front. His eyes darkened, and a deep, slow breath escaped him. "Chaplain Thomas Calloway?" he murmured, as if the name had been locked away in some forgotten part of his mind. "You knew him?" Foster asked hesitantly. Keegan's eyes lifted, sharp and piercing. "I knew him, Lieutenant. He was the best man I ever served with." Foster swallowed, sensing the weight of what he had just unearthed. Keegan placed the letter on the table in front of him, staring at it like it was something alive, something that had been waiting for him. His fingers hovered over the seal, but he didn't open it. Instead, he leaned back, rubbing his temples, the years pressing down on him all at once. "You ever hear about the operation in Cambodia, 1974? Keegan asked. Foster shook his head. "It's not surprising," Keegan muttered. "A lot of it never made it to the history books." The general's eyes drifted toward the window, as if staring back into the past. "We were sent on an unsanctioned mission. The brass didn't want it on record, so it was classified from the start. Intelligence said there was a hidden POW camp deep in the jungle, holding American soldiers long after they were declared missing. They needed a team to go in and bring them home." Foster leaned forward slightly, unable to hide his interest. Keegan continued, his voice steady but laced with something else, something heavy. "Chaplain Calloway wasn't supposed to be there, he volunteered. Said those men needed faith as much as they needed firepower. We argued about it. I told him he didn't belong in the middle of that hell. He just smiled and said, 'Where else would a chaplain be?'" Keegan exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "Went in under the cover of darkness. Everything went to hell in under an hour." Foster stayed silent, waiting. Keegan looked back at the letter. "I never saw Calloway again after that night." The room fell into silence, the weight of those words sinking in. After what felt like an eternity, Keegan finally reached forward, his hands steady now, and broke the seal on the letter. The past was about to speak. The paper was old, fragile beneath General Robert Keegan's fingertips, but the words written on it still held power. His eyes traced the shaky penmanship of Chaplain Thomas Calloway, each stroke frozen in time, preserved like an echo from the past. The ink, though faded, was still legible, and as he read, the years seemed to collapse in on themselves, dragging him back to a jungle night that had haunted him for decades. "Robert, if you're reading this, it means I didn't make it. I hope to God this letter finds its way to you, even if I know that war swallows more than just men. It swallows truth, and it swallows time. But if it does reach you, I need you to listen. There's something I never got to tell you." Keegan's breath hitched, his grip on the paper tightening as a long-buried weight settled in his chest. Across from him, Second Lieutenant Daniel Foster remained respectfully silent, watching as the general absorbed whatever message had remained hidden for so long. The letter continued. "You remember that night, don't you? The mission, the gunfire, the smoke? You ordered us forward and I followed. I was never meant to be there, but you let me come, and I don't blame you for it. I volunteered, and I would do it again. But there was something I saw that night, something I never got the chance to say. You need to know, Robert. You need to know the truth before it's too late." Keegan's fingers trembled as he turned the letter over, desperate to read faster yet afraid of what was coming. His pulse pounded in his ears. "When the gunfire started, I was behind you, praying as I always did. But when we got separated, I stumbled into something I wasn't supposed to see. A second team. Americans. Our own men. They weren't fighting to save those prisoners. We were never supposed to succeed. It was a setup, Robert. They were there to ensure we failed." Keegan's jaw clenched. His old soldier's instincts, buried beneath years of retirement and the illusion of peace, roared back to life. His mind raced. He had always known something was off about that night, the way their extraction had been delayed, the way the enemy had been expecting them, as if someone had tipped them off. He had blamed poor intelligence, bad luck, anything but betrayal. But now he wasn't so sure. "I tried to warn you, but I was hit before I could get to you. I crawled, Robert. I crawled through mud and blood, thinking I could still stop it, thinking that if I made it to you, we could fix it. But I was too late. And before I died, I saw the face of the man who sold us out." Keegan's heart hammered in his chest. "I don't know if he's still out there, Robert, but if he is, he needs to answer for what he did. You need to finish what I couldn't, because it wasn't just us who suffered. Those men, the ones we were sent to save, they never got out, and I fear the truth died with them." Silence filled the room, thick as the jungle heat Keegan could almost feel pressing against his skin. His grip on the letter was white-knuckled. His breathing had turned shallow. "Sir?" Foster's voice was careful, unsure. Keegan closed his eyes, exhaling sharply through his nose. "I need a moment." Foster nodded and stood, sensing that this was something personal, something beyond his rank to intrude upon. He walked toward the mantel, pretending to examine the various military plaques and honors displayed there. Keegan, meanwhile, stared at the last lines of the letter, the words seeming to burn themselves into his mind. "If you ever read this, know that I never regretted following you, but I couldn't let this go unknown. Do what you must, Robert, and may God forgive them, even if we never can." The signature at the bottom was faded, but the name was unmistakable. Thomas Calloway. Keegan set the letter down, his hand covering his mouth as he stared at nothing. He had spent 40 years thinking he had lost his men to war, to the chaos of battle. But now, after all these years, he had to face a darker reality. They had been betrayed. And if the man responsible was still out there, then it wasn't over yet. Keegan sat motionless, his eyes locked onto the letter as if it might change if he stared at it long enough. His entire body felt like stone, rigid, heavy, and burdened with the weight of what he had just read. 40 years. 40 years of believing in duty, in sacrifice, in the righteousness of their mission, only to be confronted with the possibility that they had been nothing more than pawns in a game played at a level far beyond them. His fingers brushed over the signature, Thomas Calloway. The name sent a flood of memories rushing through him, memories he had buried, memories he had tried to drown in medals, commendations, and quiet evenings spent with a glass of bourbon that never quite numbed the ache. Calloway had been more than a chaplain. He had been a friend, a confidant, one of the only men Keegan had ever allowed to see the weight he carried as a commander. And now, after all this time, Calloway was still leading him, even from the grave. Keegan clenched his jaw, inhaling sharply before finally looking up at Foster, who had been respectfully waiting across the room. The young lieutenant had the look of someone who wasn't sure if he had just made the biggest mistake of his life by delivering that letter. "You're sure this was in the archives?" Keegan asked, his voice steady but lined with something Foster couldn't quite place. "Yes, sir." Foster straightened his posture, standing at attention. "It was in an unmarked file, buried under decades of old reports. No one had touched it in years." Keegan exhaled through his nose, considering. "And you didn't read it?" Foster hesitated for half a second before shaking his head. "No, sir. Just enough to recognize it wasn't a standard report. I thought it was best that it got to you first." Keegan studied him. He could tell when a soldier was lying, but this kid, he was telling the truth, at least as much of it as he knew. The general turned back to the letter, his mind working through possibilities. If what Calloway had written was true, if there had been a second team working against them that night, then someone had ordered that, someone high enough to manipulate an entire mission, to ensure that no one made it out alive. And if that someone had lived past the war, if they had spent the last 40 years covering their tracks, then Keegan wasn't just sitting on a forgotten letter. He was sitting on a threat. Keegan reached for the folder on his desk and pulled out an old contact list. Most of the names were just that, names. Men long retired, scattered or buried in Arlington. But there were a few, just a handful, who might still be able to help him. Foster shifted on his feet, his curiosity barely restrained. "Sir, what does it say? What was in the letter?" Keegan tapped the edge of the paper against the desk. "Something I should have known a long time ago." A beat of silence stretched between them. Keegan finally stood, squaring his shoulders. Even after all these years, the posture of a general never left him. His voice, when he spoke, carried the weight of command. "Lieutenant, I need you to do something for me." "Yes, sir." I want you to look into something quietly. Keegan pulled a notepad from the desk drawer and wrote down a name. I need to know if this man is still alive. If he is, I need to know where. Foster took the paper, his brows furrowing as he read the name. Sir, if I may ask, who is this? Keegan's lips pressed into a hard line. His eyes burned with something that hadn't been there in years. Purpose, resolution, a ghost of the warrior he had once been. He's the man who made sure we never came home. The room was silent, except for the faint ticking of an old clock on the mantel. General Robert Keegan stood by the window, his fingers gripping the edge of the frame as he stared into the night. His mind was running, not with memories but with calculations, decisions, next steps. The letter from Chaplain Thomas Calloway lay open on the desk behind him, its weight now immeasurable. Daniel Foster sat in the chair across from the desk, the small piece of paper Keegan had handed him still clutched in his fingers. The name written on it gnawed at him. Called Richard Gable. It was a name that, by all official accounts, should not exist. Sir, Foster finally spoke, his voice careful. This man, Cole Gable. I ran his name through the current military personnel records before I came here. There's nothing. It's like he was never in the system. Keegan turned from the window, his face unreadable. You won't find him in official records, not anymore. Foster frowned, glancing down at the name again. Then who is he? Keegan walked back toward the desk, resting his hands on its surface as he looked down at the letter again. Gable was with us in Cambodia. He wasn't part of my unit, but he was there, always operating just outside the chain of command. He was attached to our mission, but not through normal channels. We called them the Shadows. Guys who seemed to answer to nobody but had more authority than they should. Foster's fingers twitched. Black Ops? Keegan nodded grimly. At the time, I didn't question it. We were soldiers, not politicians. If a man was sent along on a mission, we assumed he was there for a reason. But Calloway's letter changes that. If what he wrote is true, then Gable wasn't there to help us. He was there to make sure we didn't succeed. Foster exhaled slowly, his stomach tightening. And now you want to know if he's still alive? Keegan's eyes were sharp, unreadable. I need to know. Foster hesitated, then nodded. I can dig. It might take some time, but I'll find something. Keegan looked at him for a long moment. Then he reached for a leather-bound book on his desk, flipping through the pages until he landed on a dog-eared section. He scribbled something down, ripped the page from the book, and handed it to Foster. Start with this. It's an old contact of mine. If Gable is alive, this man will know. Foster took the paper and glanced at the name. His pulse quickened. You're sure about this? Keegan's expression hardened. Son, if what Calloway wrote in that letter is true, then this isn't just about an old betrayal. It's about a crime that's been buried for 40 years. Foster swallowed. And if Gable's still out there? Keegan straightened, his gaze dark and resolute. Then it's time he answers for what he did. Daniel Foster sat in his dimly lit apartment, the glow from his laptop screen casting shadows across the cluttered desk. The general's request weighed on him like a lead vest, each keystroke bringing him closer to a truth that had been buried for decades. The name Cole, Richard Gable, sat at the top of the search bar, staring back at him, daring him to press enter. He hesitated. Keegan's words echoed in his mind. You won't find him in official records. Still, he had to try. Foster exhaled slowly and hit search. As expected, nothing. No military records, no public citations, no trace of a man who should have, by all accounts, left some kind of footprint in history. Foster leaned back, rubbing his eyes. This wasn't just an oversight. It was deliberate. Someone had erased Gable. That meant he was exactly the kind of man Keegan was looking for. Foster tapped his fingers against the desk, thinking. There was always a trail, maybe not in the government's records, but in the world itself. He needed someone who had worked in the shadows, someone who had spent their career watching men like Gable. His mind drifted back to the name Keegan had scrawled on the paper before he left. Elliot Marsh. A retired intelligence officer, Marsh had spent decades in the field, always 2 steps ahead of the game. He had disappeared from official circles years ago, but Foster knew where to find him. A place where old ghosts went to drink and pretend they weren't looking over their shoulders. The bar was quiet, the low hum of jazz music mixing with the occasional clink of glasses. It was the kind of place where men came to be forgotten, a dimly lit haven for those whose stories never made it into history books. Foster walked in, scanning the room. He spotted him instantly. Elliot Marsh. The man was older than Foster expected, his gray hair cropped close, his frame still strong despite the years. He nursed a whiskey at the far end of the bar, his eyes flicking up briefly as Foster approached. "You're sitting in the wrong place for a man in uniform," Marsh muttered without looking up. Foster didn't flinch. "I'm not in uniform." Marsh snorted. "You're wearing it in your spine. Sit down." Foster slid into the seat across from him, keeping his movements slow. He didn't need to make an enemy of this man. Not yet. "I need information," Foster said, "on a man named Richard Gable." The name was like a gunshot in the quiet space. Marsh's fingers tightened around his glass. His eyes, sharp and knowing, finally met Foster's. "You really don't want to go down that road, son." Foster held his ground. "It's not my choice." It's not." Marsh studied him for a long moment before exhaling, setting his drink down. "You military types always think you're chasing ghosts." He leaned forward, lowering his voice. "But Gable? He's not a ghost. He's still breathing." Foster felt his pulse quicken. "Where?" Marsh shook his head. "Not here, not in front of people." He tossed back the rest of his whiskey and pulled a napkin from the bar. Scribbling something down, he slid it toward Foster. "Be careful what you dig up, Lieutenant," Marsh warned. "Some men don't like being found." Foster looked down at the napkin. An address. The hunt had just begun. The air inside the old diner was thick with the scent of grilled burgers and stale coffee. It was the kind of place where secrets were shared over cigarettes and whiskey at ungodly hours. General Robert Keegan walked in with the measured steps of a man who had carried burdens heavier than most. His body might have aged, but his instincts were still razor-sharp. Across the room, a man sat alone in a booth, his back against the wall, eyes scanning every entry point, just like Keegan's once did. Elliot Marsh. The former intelligence officer had aged but not softened. His piercing blue eyes locked onto Keegan as he slid into the booth across from him. Without a word, Marsh reached into his jacket, pulled out a small flask, and took a slow sip before setting it on the table. His silence carried weight. He had been expecting this meeting. Keegan placed a folded piece of paper on the table and slid it toward Marsh. The name, written in sharp, deliberate handwriting, sent a ripple through the air. Richard Gable. Marsh's expression didn't change, but Keegan saw the slight tightening of his jaw, the way his fingers curled against the flask just a fraction harder than before. That told him everything. "You don't ask about a name like that unless you already know the answer," Marsh muttered, voice low. "I need to find him," Keegan said simply. Marsh let out a slow exhale, leaning back against the booth. "Funny thing about ghosts, Keegan. Some of them don't want to be found." Keegan held his gaze steady. "He's not a ghost. He's unfinished business." Marsh smirked, but there was no humor in it. He tapped a finger against the table. "Let me tell you something, General. Some men spend their whole lives thinking they buried the past. Then one day, a name like that crawls out of the dirt. You sure you're ready for this?" Keegan didn't hesitate. "I wouldn't be here if I wasn't." For the first time, something in Marsh's demeanor shifted. A flicker of old loyalty, perhaps even respect. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a crumpled napkin, scribbling something onto it. When he slid it back across the table, his eyes locked onto Keegan's with a knowing intensity. "Last I heard he's living quiet. Changed his name, got himself a nice little piece of nowhere, but you don't come looking for a man like Gable unless you're ready to deal with what you find." Keegan picked up the napkin, glanced at the address scrawled in barely legible handwriting, and folded it into his pocket. "Appreciated, Marsh." Marsh let out a dry chuckle. "No, you don't. Not yet." Keegan slid out of the booth, nodding once before heading for the door. He could feel Marsh's eyes on his back as he stepped outside into the night. The past wasn't done with him yet. And neither was Richard Gable. The road stretched long and empty, winding through the backwoods of North Carolina. General Robert Keegan kept his grip firm on the steering wheel, his mind racing as he neared his destination. The address scrawled on the napkin in his pocket had led him far from any signs of civilization. No streetlights, no towns, no prying eyes, just the thick canopy of trees lining the narrow two-lane road and the distant hum of insects singing their eerie tune. Richard Gable, or whatever name he had taken for himself, had gone through great lengths to disappear. Keegan pulled off onto a gravel driveway, the tires crunching softly over the loose rock. Ahead, barely visible between the trees, sat a weathered cabin, its wooden frame blending into the wilderness like it had been abandoned decades ago. The place was quiet, too quiet. He cut the engine but didn't step out immediately. Instead, he took a moment to survey the property. One truck, old but well-maintained, sat near the porch. A fresh stack of chopped firewood suggested the cabin was very much in use. Somewhere inside, Richard Gable was living out his days in hiding. Keegan exhaled and opened the car door. The second his foot hit the ground, a voice called out, "That's close enough." The voice was steady, calm, like a man who had already anticipated this moment. Keegan turned his head slightly, eyes scanning the tree line until he saw it. The glint of a rifle barrel peeking out from a hunting blind set up just beyond the porch. "I was hoping for a warmer welcome," Keegan said, his voice even. "It depends on what you're here for," the voice answered. The barrel didn't lower. "You came a long way, General. I figured it was only a matter of time before someone did." Keegan raised his hands slightly, showing he wasn't armed. "I didn't come to settle old scores, Gable. I just want to talk." A pause, then the rifle barrel disappeared. A few moments later, the cabin door creaked open, and out stepped a man Keegan hadn't seen in 40 years. Richard Gable was older now. His once dark hair turned silver, his face lined with age, but there was no mistaking him. His eyes, sharp and calculating, still carried the same weight they did back in Cambodia. He stood on the porch, arms crossed over his chest, watching Keegan with an unreadable expression. "You really should have let this go," Gable muttered. "Some things are better left buried." Keegan stepped forward, his jaw tight. "That's the thing about the past, Gable. It never stays buried." A long silence stretched between them. Then, with a slow nod, Gable motioned toward the door. "Well then," he said quietly, "you'd better come inside." As Keegan followed him in, he knew one thing for certain. The truth was finally coming to the surface. The inside of the cabin was sparse, practical. A single wooden table, a few chairs, a small bookshelf, and a fireplace that crackled softly against the silence. The walls were lined with maps, old military schematics, and a faded photograph of a platoon. Men standing side by side, their faces frozen in time. Keegan recognized the faces immediately, his unit. Gable walked to a side table, picking up a bottle of whiskey and 2 glasses. He poured himself a drink, but left the second glass untouched. Keegan made no move to take it. "You came all this way for answers," Gable muttered, sinking into a chair. "Might as well get to it." Keegan remained standing. His eyes swept across the room, noting the absence of anything personal, no family photos, no signs of a life built outside of whatever nightmare Gable had been running from. "You were there that night in Cambodia," Keegan said. "You and your team." Gable took a slow sip of whiskey before nodding. Keegan clenched his fists. Calloway saw you. He saw what you did." At that, Gable let out a humorless chuckle, shaking his head. "That Chaplain was always too damned observant for his own good," He leaned back in his chair, exhaling. "I won't insult you by lying, Keegan. We were sent there to clean up a mess. Only problem was, you and your men weren't supposed to make it out alive." The words hung in the air like a noose tightening around Keegan's throat. "Who gave the order?" Keegan's voice was low, controlled, but Gable could hear the fury beneath it. It didn't come from one man. It was bigger than that," Gable said, swirling his whiskey. "We weren't just fighting the Viet Cong out there. There were things happening in the shadows, things that couldn't be made public. The prisoners we were sent to rescue weren't prisoners at all. They were liabilities, loose ends that needed tying up." Keegan took a step closer, his chest tight. "They were our men." Gable's gaze hardened. "They were experiments." Silence. Keegan's pulse roared in his ears. He had expected betrayal, corruption, but this was something else entirely. "They were subjected to things," Gable continued, his voice quieter now. "Things that the higher-ups didn't want getting out. Your mission wasn't about rescue. It was about erasing evidence. Only you weren't supposed to know that." Keegan's breath came slow and steady, but his hands trembled at his sides. "They sent you to make sure we never left that jungle," Keegan said, his voice cold. Gable exhaled sharply, rubbing his temple. "It wasn't personal, General. Orders are orders." Keegan's jaw tightened. "Calloway died because of you." Gable met his gaze evenly. "A lot of good men did." The room fell into silence once more. Keegan had spent 40 years living with the ghosts of that night, believing he had failed his men. But now the truth was uglier than he ever imagined. And the men responsible weren't ghosts. They were still out there, still pulling the strings, still needing to answer for their sins. The air inside the cabin felt thick, heavy with the weight of decades-old secrets. General Robert Keegan stood across from Richard Gable, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. The fire in the hearth crackled softly, casting flickering shadows across the room. Gable sat back in his chair, watching Keegan with the tired indifference of a man who had already accepted his sins. "You knew," Keegan finally said, his voice low and measured but carrying the sharp edge of barely restrained fury. "You knew we were never supposed to make it out of that jungle alive." Gable let out a slow breath, setting his glass down with a dull clink. "I knew," he admitted. "But I didn't have a choice." Keegan's eyes burned. "There's always a choice." Gable scoffed. "Not in the world we lived in. You think I liked it? You think I wanted that mission to go the way it did? I followed orders just like you did." He leaned forward, his gaze darkening. "Only difference is, my orders came from a place where men like you didn't get to ask questions." Keegan took a step forward, the anger in his chest rising like a storm. "Those men, my men, trusted me. Calloway trusted me. And you let them die." A bitter smirk crossed Gable's face. "And what would you have done, General? Gone rogue? Turned on your own country? The truth is, we were part of something bigger than ourselves. We were expendable pieces on a board that neither of us were meant to control." Keegan's jaw tightened. He had spent 40 years carrying the weight of that night, believing it was a failure of command, a tragic outcome of war. But now, he saw the truth for what it was. Murder, wrapped in the illusion of patriotism. "I should kill you," Keegan said, his voice barely above a whisper. Gable exhaled, reaching into his pocket. For a moment, Keegan tensed, expecting a weapon, but instead, Gable pulled out a folded piece of paper and tossed it onto the table. "You're not the only one who's been looking for answers," Gable said. "I knew this day would come, and I know you won't stop until you get what you came for." Keegan hesitated before reaching for the paper. As he unfolded it, his heart pounded. It was a list. Names, dates, locations, the men who had given the orders, the ones who had profited from their betrayal. And at the very top, a name Keegan never expected to see. A name that still held power. Keegan's blood ran cold. "He's still alive?" Gable nodded. and still untouchable. But if anyone can change that, it's you. Silence stretched between them. The weight of what lay ahead settled heavily on Keegan's shoulders. He had spent a lifetime serving his country, believing in the honor of the uniform. Now he realized that the real battle had never ended. He folded the paper and slipped it into his pocket. "I'm going to finish this," Keegan said, his voice steady. "Not for revenge, not for war." Gable gave him a knowing look. "For justice?" Keegan turned toward the door, pausing only once before stepping outside. The night was colder than before, the wind biting against his skin, but for the first time in 40 years, he felt like he had a purpose again. As he walked toward his car, he knew one thing with absolute certainty. This wasn't over. It was just beginning,